All right, we're ready, man.
Okay, well tonight we have a guest lecturer, Dr. Brent Hales, Senior Associate Dean, University of Minnesota Extension, and formerly Department Chair of Economic Development. Can't remember what it was called back then. Workforce and Economic Development.
Right.
Brent's been doing a lot of social network analysis, so I thought it'd be interesting for the class to hear about this as a methodological approach. So, Brent, please take it away.
Okay. Well, I actually kind of built in a little bit of interaction, but for lack of an actual class meeting, I think we'll just kind of skip that part of it. Let's see how I work this. You'll have to forgive me. I'm still getting used to this thing here. All right. So I was going to have you all introduce yourself, but we're going to skip that. So a little bit about me. I grew up in a little town in south central Utah called Aurora, a little town of about 950 people, and graduated from Brigham Young University in 1994 with a degree in sociology, Middle Tennessee State in 96 with a degree in sociology, and Iowa State with a PhD in rural sociology, where my focus was really on rural families, community and economic development, and Native American development. As Chad said, I was in Mississippi. I actually went there after graduating from Iowa State and taught at Delta State University from 2000 to 2006. And in 2006 went to Southern Miss and was there until 2012, and I've been at Minnesota ever since then. I came here to be Associate Dean over the Center for Community Vitality in the University of Minnesota Extension, and in November became Senior Associate Dean and Chief Financial Officer of the college. My research has really focused on tribal community and economic development, innovation and tech-based development, entrepreneurship, education, and development. And while at Southern Miss, I founded the Southern Entrepreneurship Program in 2007. And after Hurricane Katrina, did some work on civic engagement and post-disaster communities. But most of my research has actually been in asset-based development and strategic planning, and where I've actually done strategic plans for over 20 communities, and some of them as small as a couple thousand people, all the way up to a large metropolitan, statistical area plans. Most of them ranged anywhere from 5 to 7 years, and they were focused on asset-based development, where network analysis was an important part of the process that we went through in doing it, but also the product. And I'm actually working, I have a joint faculty position with the Humphrey School of Public Policy here at the University of Minnesota, and I'm doing a strategic plan for a city here in Minnesota right now with a course that I'm teaching on regional economic and workforce development at the Humphrey School. In economic development, you're going to have some challenges. Predominantly, most economic developers don't land in their hometown, which means you're going to be coming to a new locale, and all communities or regions have a context in which they have been developed, in which they reside. So they have their own history, their own economy, religion, culture, race, ethnicity. They have diverse resources, and so assuming that you have the challenge of moving into a community, you're going to have to get up to speed on that. And one of the things you're really going to have to figure out is who it is that you're working with, and who it is that you where your resources lie, and a lot of that has to do with also where the networks are that you have available to you. This picture on the slide is actually a town called St. James, and And the University of Minnesota Extension worked with St. James in doing a variety of projects. And if you look at the picture, I realize I apologize for the poor graphics, but it's an extremely diverse community, and they also recognize that it's only going to become more diverse. And so the networks that they have to work with and need to utilize continue to become more and more diverse as they go on. Again, some of the challenges that you're going to have is little knowledge of the context when you walk into a community. You may be able to do some social reconnaissance, figure out what are some of the salient issues, but you're going to have to figure out what are the relevant issues, who's connected with whom, what are the power dynamics in the community, and where the reputational power lies. Also, you're going to have to avoid landmines, and that means you're going to have to understand who you have the ability and necessity of connecting with and connecting to in order for you to be successful. In doing this, you're going to build your capacity to do your job, but also build the capacity of the community to accomplish its goals and its missions. Really, your job is to put yourself out of business. If you look at it in terms of from a sustainability perspective. Now, we're not in any danger of that. I've never heard of an economic developer that was so effective he or she lost their job, and so again, we're not in any danger of that. But that truly is the ideal. So to give you some broad perspective on networks, if we look at communities, they really range on what's called a rural to urban continuum, with a rural community typology being typified by dense overlapping social networks where family, religion, politics, employment, economic ties, it's very homogeneous, meaning all of these networks really overlap and overlay. And the ties that bind the community together are largely informal and based on social norms more than formal codes or laws. Acceptance of the new is different and limited. The reason why I brought up my hometown is population 950 people currently. When my parents got married, my dad's family was from there. Both of them actually grew up in California, but they moved there to that small town after they married, and they've been married over 50 years now, and my mom is still the girl from California. Go figure. So what that means is that rural communities, by and large, are very dense, they're self-referencing, and there's a connectivity between the social resources, the resources of all types, and the community, and so your ability to access those is impacted by those dense networks. And there's significant impacts for breaking social norms. On the other end of the spectrum of this continuum is the urban community typology, where the networks don't necessarily or ever overlap, so the people that you work with, you may not be related to, you may not have any social connectedness with, you may not go to church with them. If you go to church, your connectedness is largely based on the fact that you're occupying the same space. If you've ever lived in a major urban area, you may not know your next door neighbors, whereas in rural areas, like where I grew up, I lived at the very top end of my hometown. It was based in the mountains, and we literally lived at the top of town, and my friends were down at the bottom of town, and if I screwed up, there's a very good chance that by the time that I got home, I may have been talked to by 3 or 4 different relatives who all lived in that same small town. In urban communities, the ties that bind the community together are formal laws and codes. Acceptance of the new and different is expected, and it's quite often externally referencing, meaning what goes on in other cities is seen as what may be coming to your community. And so there's a completely different power differential from rural communities, where those formal codes and laws carry a lot of weight, whereas it's not necessarily the case, always the case rather, in rural communities. Social network analysis has its roots in anthropology, sociology, and at the end of my presentation I'll actually give you some of the reference. I'll give you all the references that I use in this, so you'll have access to these as well. It also enables the researcher to assess both the micro and macro levels of social theory, and it arises from a couple of approaches. Number one, the interactional approach to communities that Kaufman and later his student Ken Wilkinson, with his community field theory, looked at how we interact. The basis of our communities are on the basis of our interaction, the denseness of our interactions, the number, the quality of our interactions. So they saw social network analysis and social networks as really the ties that bind the community together. So much of my presentation will emerge from 3 articles: Streeter and Gillespie, Surratt, and Sharp. And again, those references are available to you at the end of the presentation. A social network is defined as any bounded set of connected social units, wherein those networks have boundaries. So, for instance, when you go to work in a community, you may look at what those boundaries are, specific to the formal boundaries of that community, but in all reality, it may or may not reflect the totality of what the residents see as what that community is. So you need to figure out what the boundaries of the community are, reputationally, economically, politically, again, understanding that context. There's also an element to connectedness in the networks. If you look down at the picture, networks are defined by their social unit, and that unit may be down on the individual level. Each one of these, down in the picture, each one of these balls represent a node or an individual, a group, an organization that may or may not have connectedness to anybody else, and therefore they're not at all in a network, or they may have a single tie or many ties. The balls in the picture represent the larger the node. It represents the number of ties that they have to other nodes in the network. So that kind of gives you a little bit of perspective on there. Structural properties. The properties of social networks. Structural properties describe the way in which the members fit and form the social network. So there are 3 levels of analysis. What is going on with the individual actors or the individual members within the network, and how they impact and are impacted by their interaction with the other members, and the degree to which they give and receive what's the valuable resources. There are also subgroups within the network, and they may operate in and of themselves as their own separate node within the larger network. So you may have a bunch of organizations that bind together, and for all intents and purposes act like as one node. And then you end up with the total network, which you find both strong and weak ties. So for instance, you likely know people that I don't know, and I likely know people that you don't know. But if we share that common tie, if you and I know each other, it's possible that if I have a need, I can go through you to get that need met, and vice versa. And so that's the strength of the network, and how we can assess that strength is the reciprocal nature of those interactions. And so as you begin kind of tearing apart a network, you can really begin to assess the strength of that network by the common ties that they share with other individuals and subgroups within that network, as well as the level of interaction, and also the degree to which they perceive that interaction as valuable. Some of the relational properties within the transactional content and I've alluded to this a little bit, of a network, resources. Those can be physical goods, the personnel, the services. So if we're looking at an economic network, or a cluster is a good example of a network, you may capitalize on the same type of raw resources, the same types of workforce, the same personnel. You may group resources and services. So that's a good way of identifying a network, and also some of the content that makes up a network. There's also information that is shared amongst a network, whether it's descriptions, opinions, ideas, facts. A network also has the ability to bring power and influence, and specifically binding the individuals together brings greater resources. So whether it's power, prestige, legitimation of the group's ideas and identity, advice. Again, these are some of the benefits and what happens as transactions occur within that network. And then there's also the measure of social support, comfort, encouragement, inspiration, and so forth. So this has a number of impacts and a number of valuable ways that within economic development we can think about the utilization of diverse networks. Think of a Chamber of Commerce, for example. They provide a lot of those resources, a lot of that support, a lot of the connectedness that was displayed in that previous slide. The nature of those relationships is also important when looking at a network. The significance of that relationship. If I just have a common tie, that doesn't necessarily mean that relationship is necessarily important to me. Now, it may be at one point, but not at another. And so simply participating in a network or the identification of a network does not necessarily mean that there's a significance among all actors or all nodes within that network. Also, the frequency of occurrence or rate of recurrence of the interaction amongst the network also defines the potential impact, importance, and the value to the individual actors and nodes. There's also formal recognition. Just because people share common ties does not necessarily make them a network. And so it's a measure of official recognition of this grouping and these interactions as a network that brings the real power behind these interactions and the formal recognition of this network, particularly when you're talking about it from a business or economic development perspective. People interact, but if it's not done under the banner or the umbrella of a network, it doesn't carry the same weight. There's also a standardization that takes place within networks. If you think about a Chamber of Commerce, they have roles and expectations. They have defined procedures and expectations for exchange, what it means to be part of a network. Think about social groups. There's an expectation if you belong to a social group, say Rotary, that you're going to attend a certain number of meetings, that you're going to be part of it, not just be a network member in name only. There are also structural properties within networks. Individual members of a network, when we look at them and really study them out, there's a question of centrality. How close are you to the total network? What are the number of linkages? So relative to the entire number of members. So if you have a whole bunch of people that are connected and may be connected with one who's connected with another, that's connected with another, that's connected with another, but none of them come together and are interconnected, the centrality of that network is very, very low. And as a result, the potential impact of that network is also very, very low. Similarly, the connectedness of those members mean that they share not just membership in one subgroup, but potentially multiple subgroups. And think of this in terms of boards. Let's say I serve on one community board, and I join a second, or I become part of another community board, or a third community board. Suddenly, that first organization that I'm on the board with now has connectedness to the other two boards that I'm now serving on, and so there's a weak tie that goes between those three boards. And that's me. Now, what happens if we add another person that also serves on one or maybe all three of those boards? Then the connectedness, the strength of those connections, the strength of those ties significantly increases, not just by a power of one, but significantly, statistically significantly. The distance, that's the number of links connecting two members. Again, and this gets at if I belong to the Chamber of Commerce, I also belong to a library board, I belong to the golf club, I belong to some of these other different organizations, and suddenly the same board members start linking up, or the same organizational members start linking up. The distance between those organizations shrinks, and so you're building connectivity across those organizations and across the network. That's not necessarily always good. If you think about going back to the rural versus urban typology, the denseness of the social network in rural communities is heavily dense. There's a lot of interconnectedness and very small distance, and so they're very dense networks, which is fine in terms of reputational power, but for a new person trying to get into those networks, it's pinging. It's very tough to get into those networks. As a result, what you end up with, particularly as you move more towards the urban typology, is you end up with greater distance between those networks, and depending on the association and the connectedness, you may end up with a greater number of subgroups that have greater distance between one another, and those are often along the interest groups play a greater role than perhaps it's the common interest that binds those organizations together. So the subgroups, in looking at a network, you need to assess the number of subgroups, as well as the size, the number of members in each subgroup, and the connectedness between those subgroups, to which you look at the distance between those subgroups and the common ties that they have. And what you find is that the more you dig into this, that you are able to really kind of tear apart the context of a community by examining its groups and its subgroups. Also, does the subgroup have linkages out to other groups, as well as not just a single person, but perhaps others, multiple linkages. And so is it an open one, or is it a closed subgroup or closed network? In looking at the total network, you got to look at the total size in terms of the number of members, the density, the ratio of actual potential connections. So if you have, if it's very dense subgroups, but very few connections between them, the question is it truly a dense network? Whereas, and again, going back to the rural versus urban continuum, the denseness of a total network in a rural community is much more dense than in an urban community, typically. There's also a question of hierarchy, the extent to which these connections are directed upward. Is there a level? Is it fairly flat? Or is it hierarchical, meaning there's an expectation of capital and resources in order to penetrate the network. And then, again, coming back to this concept of centrality, the degree to which the connections are directed through one or a few central units of the network. Is there greater power within the total network? And I'll get into this in the case studies. I'll try and make this make sense as I get into these case studies. So this is a slide. This is a picture of some of the the board members of America's big companies. And what you see is within some of these companies, they share common board members. Now some of these are very, very dense, meaning they have a lot of connectedness between, and they may share one or even two, three board members. And so the strength of those ties between those large companies indicate their ability to actually see themselves as a network and have reciprocal interaction, and it increases the closeness as well as the ability of themselves to see themselves as a network. Networks in and of themselves can be nodes. So when you look at a large metropolitan area, there are a number of networks that come together, and each individual network can be seen as a node in and of itself in the larger superstructure. So these social networks are nodes of individuals, groups, organizations, related systems that tie into one or more types of interdependencies again, and this kind of comes back to how they work with and handle conflict and social context, financial exchanges and trades, membership in organizational group, participation in events, and it really is impacted by the perception of whether these networks provide value to the individual members and to the nodes. Effectiveness is the ability to move beyond that rigid hierarchical structure and control bureaucracies. Down in the bottom corner, you see this is a typical network. This is what it's very hierarchical. Those are, I want to say, fairly ineffective in terms of the ability of individual actors, individual members of that network to actually impact and make change. The influence of larger social processes can be, you can really kind of tear this apart, particularly as you begin to look at power, the ability to control resources, whether it's, and have access to those resources, whether it's human capital, social capital, natural, physical, financial capital, as well as who controls those and how those various forms of capital are used. And networks have the ability to impact and be impacted by policies, strategies, programs, and projects. So this is an example of a large network. And as you can see, some of these individual nodes are way, way out. They're not at all centralized. As a matter of fact, they're very distant from the rest of the network. Whereas in some of these larger bubbles, more densely connected, you see that you can actually look at some of these and define some of these as actual subgroups within the larger network. But if you look at the interconnectedness between some of these organizations or some of these individual nodes, that's denoted as whether they share common ties. And this can be a combination of sharing of resources, be it board members, be it members of the connectedness. It can be on the basis of formal ties that they share, whether it be reciprocal arrangements and so forth. So I put that in there just to show you an example of a very large network where some of the, I would say probably the majority of the power lies very much in the center, and the ability to impact the entirety, the totality of that network is very much controlled by the center. And so while you may have an individual node out here, they're more impacted by and have the ability to impact less the network than some of these larger nodes. So what does this mean for you? Well, as an economic developer, in every community there are networks. And in every community there are also starters, sustainers, and stoppers. If you want to start a project, there are people that need to be engaged in the process. Or at least they're very effective in starting projects. Similarly, they may or may not reflect the individuals or organizations that are effective at sustaining projects. And also in every community or region, there are people with one phone call, man, they can kill a project. It's dead. And so understanding who those are, how they're connected with the rest of the network is really important, particularly when you're doing economic development, when you're doing strategic planning and the like. According to Agner, Flora, and Hernandez, these different organizations, that you find starters, stoppers, and sustainers in government, business, and what they call civil society. I like civic organizations. And in my own work, in assessing community, in doing strategic planning, I won't go into a community, I won't work with a community in doing an asset-based strategic plan unless all three of those, government, business, and civic organizations, are at the table. That we have broad representation from across the community, and that we map out those starters, sustainers, and stoppers. And I find this out in three ways. Number one, I do focus groups. Tomorrow, for the city of Rosemont, here in Minnesota, it's a suburb of the larger metro. We're going to do a focus group. And I get very specific in asking them targeted questions that get at figuring out who is engaged, what the networks are, and how the community utilizes those resources. I also use what's called a individual civic leader survey that assesses from a reputational power standpoint, who are the starters, who are the stoppers, and who are the sustainers. In the 20-plus communities that I've worked with in doing strategic planning, it's been interesting, and this is a line of research that I'm engaged in right now. Oftentimes, and this is true more so in communities that are multiracial, that have a disparity in economic terms, and where there is a large underclass. Typically, government and business by the dominant group, whether that's dominant in terms of economic, assuming you have an entirely white community or an entirely African American community or what have you, it's impacted by class. Race, ethnicity impact multiracial communities, but by and large, government and business are seen as starters and stoppers. When you survey those with reputational power, those with economic power, you find that they're more likely to name the starters as government and business, the sustainers as government and business, and the stoppers as civic organizations. Those who lack the power often see the starters and sustainers as the civic organizations and the stoppers as government and business. And it's because of a historical, again, understanding the context of communities, because of the historical battle over scarce resources and the ability to impact policy and the like. And in the 20-plus communities that I've worked with, I've yet to find one that breaks that trend. And so, and I've got data to back that up. Some more benefits of understanding those networks. identifying individuals or teams or units that can play those central roles. Where's the power? Who is connected with whom? It also enables you to discern informational breakdowns, where the bottlenecks are in information sharing, where structural holes are in terms of leadership, in terms of economic power. Who are those isolated individuals, teams, and units? And how do we then bring them back in? It also enables you to make out opportunities to accelerate knowledge flows across organizational boundaries, and also to strengthen the efficiency of those existing organizations, those existing networks, through formal communication channels as well as through informal communication challenges as well, or channels rather as well. It also raises the awareness of and reflection on the importance of those informal networks. Again, particularly as you go to more rural communities, as you move out of the structural power into working with individuals, organizations that may be on a node on their own. Those informal networks play a much more important role than do the formal networks as you move out of centrality. It also enables you to leverage peer support, improve innovation and learning, refine your own strategies through evaluation and assessment, and to be very deliberate in how you approach engaging communities and assessing the impact of policy, the impact of development projects on the totality of the community. And again, it helps you avoid getting blasted, not seeing something coming and getting hammered from the side, you know, those landmines that are always there. The process, so how do we do this? Well, we identify the network of individuals, teams, and units to be analyzed. So what does the community look like? What is the boundaries? And how do you do this? Gather as much background information as you can, whether it be through, like I'm doing in Rosemont, doing focus groups, collecting surveys. We published the survey online, and I've asked for broad representation from across the community, residents, businesses, government, civic organizations, just really kind of blowing up who gets to provide information to and about the community. It also is important to define the objectives. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to get out of this? And clarify the scope of your analysis. It may be that you hone in on one of the subgroups versus look at the totality of the network as a whole. Then formulate hypotheses, kind of what do you expect to get out of this? What do you expect to find? And then develop a survey methodology. As part of the work that I'm doing in Rosemont, we're doing a large community meeting as well. Why are we doing that? Because focus groups tend to be guarded, and it's difficult for groups that aren't seen as part of the larger, part of the centralized network to penetrate those. And so how I combat that is not only the individual surveys, but also through inviting the wider public to community meetings and providing them with the ability to impact both the process and the product. That's the only way it's sustainable. These efforts are sustainable is if you bring in that broad representation from across the community. Design questionnaires. Keep the questions straight to the point. Chad, what I'll do is I'll actually send you both the focus group questions that I'm going to use, as well as the individual civic leader survey that I'm using as well, to kind of give the students the idea of how I'm doing this. You survey the individuals, the teams, the units in the network to identify those networks and knowledge flows. I ask them who's connected with whom. If you serve on a board, which one, and what's your role in that board, or if you're part of an organization. Who's not at the table, and so we're going to do that. And then we're using a social analysis tool, network analysis tool, to map that network. And what's really surprising in every single community that I've done this in is when you present that network tool and they see the connectedness and how far these groups are out there, perhaps, it's amazing to see. It's really eye-opening to them. Charles asked, how do you break into little groups that have the power, and for whom does it pay to share what they know? What we do is we get buy-in. We help facilitate the process by getting those individuals who perhaps are on their individual node or may not have access to the power into the process. And in so doing, what it does is it builds the network and increases the density and the impact of the various processes that we go through. And I'll give you some examples in a minute when we talk about the case studies, Charles. So if you'll just bear with me for just a minute. Then we review the map. So I'll actually take them through this process where, again, not only are we going to map the resources within the community, but we're going to map the network. And then I bring it back. And it's an eye-opening experience for them. And then we design. It's after this point that we actually get into the strategic planning process. So there's a lot of build-up to it. But this is what makes it effective, because once we've identified all the resources, they identify them. I don't identify them. They identify all the resources within using the community capitals framework. They identify what they're willing to support, what they're willing to do, and we make sure that we have broad representation from across the community, both in terms of input as well as practice in determining what gets done, so that it's equitable both in terms of the benefits and the costs of these development projects. That's when the community takes ownership of the process and the product. And then we begin connecting the starters, the sustainers, and the stoppers in the process along the way. After that, then we map the network again, because what I've found in every community, short of one, actually short of two, and I'll share one of those communities that it didn't work in. The network, what happens is some of those that are way out there, some of those nodes that are not hardly connected, get brought in and become much more part of the process, as well as take ownership of the product of the development efforts. So here's a couple case studies for you. When I was a graduate student, I was part of a project where we looked at Bellevue, Iowa, and this is when I was at Iowa State. It's a river city right on the Mississippi River. There's a lock and dam located there. Approximately 2,200 people in the small town. They wanted an asset assessment and for us to help them define and design strategic initiatives that they could take on, that they could then build using their existing assets and bring in the various aspects of their community. But in order for us to do this and to really make sure that we were representing the totality of the community, we assessed the existing networks where we looked at the board structures. We did the focus groups, and I did a lot of focus groups in this case. I spent time listening. I went to the coffee clubs. I went to the various boards, and I listened, and I began to connect. And I did, in the town of 2,200 people, I did over 100 interviews, key informant surveys, as well as the community meetings to figure out who was connected with whom and what were some of the most important and salient issues, so that we got this broad representation. Now, I'll be honest, I don't get to do that often. I was a graduate student, and it was a semester-long project, and so I had the ability to really dig deep, and I had that commitment on the part of the community. They weren't looking for this to happen tomorrow, and so they were willing to go through the process with me. But we mapped the business organizations like the banks and the chambers of commerce, who their boards were, who was connected to them. We looked at the civic organizations, the library board, the PTA, the church boards, the golf club, the coffee club, the card clubs, you name it, we mapped them. The governmental organizations, the city council, the commissions, the utility commission, you name it. We really tried to go over the top in terms of mapping this. And then we assessed the reputational power. We assessed who were the starters, who were the sustainers, and who were the stoppers. And then we looked at the interconnections of the boards, and we assessed those connections by the common ties. So the connection was a power of one, if let's say two boards have one common board member. The strength of those connections went up as they added more and more cross-connected. And we use this to engage the community leaders and also bring in those diverse groups that perhaps didn't have a voice at the table. And you can comment in the chat box, which of the following do you think was the most connected or powerful organizational board? Had the most interconnections? Do you think it was the Chamber of Commerce, the City Council, and there were two bank boards? But if it was a bank board, the Country Club, there was both a public school board and a parochial school board, a utility commission. Just rough guess. What do you think it was? I'll give you a chance to comment. The school board, parochial school board, the City Council. Actually, it was the Country Club. Blew my mind. I had no clue. And when I went in to the community, the Country Club is actually not in the city of Bellevue at all. It's actually located just outside. But most of the farmers that had a significant proportion of the reputational power, they were seen as the starters and the stoppers by and large. There was also a lawyer in town that was seen as one of the stoppers. They had significant reputational power. And if you wanted to get something done, you didn't go to a utility commission board. You didn't go to the chamber or to the city council. You went 5:30 in the morning when the farmers were there at the country club and had coffee with them. Blew my mind. We weren't expecting that at all. So what we ended up doing is we ended up setting our planning meetings, the community meetings, not at 6 o'clock at night during the middle of the summer when all the farmers were still working. We did it. We had a couple community meetings to accommodate where the reputational power was at 5:30 in the morning in the country club. I never expected 120 members to show up at the country club at 5:30 in the morning to provide input into this process, but that's exactly what happened. That one thing was my greatest takeaway and continues to be one of the most important things that I learned. My perception as an outsider would have been greatly impacted. My effectiveness as a researcher, as someone who was brought in to provide them with a strategic planning assessment, I would not reflected the community at all. And as a result, the decisions that were made, the projects that they said they wanted to take on would have been greatly affected and significantly impacted by who was not at the table in this case. So it's one of those. It's one thing to know the networks where you're assessing density. So in the case of Bellevue, we looked at the networks and we assessed the density, but it was only in looking at those strengths of those ties that we really got at where the power was. From there, we were able to utilize that network in building collaborations, bringing those groups that perhaps didn't have all of the network that, say, the country club did into this process. It also enabled us to make effective use of those networks as it happened. We couldn't go about it passively. We had to be very deliberate in how we did this. And again, this was the very first project that I was engaged in as a graduate student, and it's impacted the rest of my career in working in community strategic planning. But it also helped me identify the groups that are not involved in this process, where those gaps were, and what the potential loss of those resources were. In the case of Bellevue, it would have been tremendous. We would have not had a broad representation, and as a result, the projects that they ultimately said they wanted to do, that they were willing to do, would not have happened. So we ended up doing a 7-year strategic plan with them. They finished because of the ownership that was bought in, because we reflected the network and got their buy-in and all the resources that the whole network brought in. They actually accomplished the 7-year strategic plan in a little over 4 years. We didn't expect that. We didn't see that coming. And so Jan Flora, who I actually made reference to in terms of some of the work, or in the earlier presentation, he ended up having to go back because they had accomplished everything, and began working again with them to go through this process again. And the impacts of that project, believe it or not, we finished that in, I want to say, in 1998. If you go to Bellevue today, they're still citing that as sort of a seminal point. And I've not been back to Bellevue, by the way. I would like to go, but they wouldn't recognize me anyway. I was a whole lot younger back then, and I was, but they still cite it as influential in terms of the trajectory of their community. Case study number 2: the Meskwaki band of the Sac and Fox tribe. The Meskwakis were in central Iowa, and this is, again, as a graduate student. I'm giving you 2 examples. What happened is that we were asked to, again, use the same process. This was a year later, to conduct a community-based development initiative. We did our social reconnaissance. We found out that there were 3 clans that were important in both the reputation as well as how the tribe functioned. And so there were the Old Bears, the Young Bears, and the Pashtuniquas. So I made sure that we had representation in terms of, we made sure that we had, we interviewed and connected with Old Bears, we connected with the Young Bears, and we connected with the Pashtuniquas. We spent 6 months, I spent 6 months of my life working on this project. And we developed a strategic plan, and I was going to present it on Tuesday morning to the tribal council. I called them up, called the executive director of the tribe on a Friday, made sure we were still good to go. Monday he was going to come, and Monday night he was going to come speak to the graduate students at Iowa State. I called him Monday morning because I found out that I got him an honorarium. I tried to call him anyway, and found out that he had been fired. He had been let go over the weekend. And I said, well, is so-and-so Young Bear there? No, he's no longer working for the tribe. Okay. How about this person whose last name was Old Bear? No. Frank Pashtuniqua? No. None of the people that I worked with were at all employed by the tribe anymore, and I couldn't get in touch with any of them. And what happened was I became persona non grata overnight, not because of anything that I had done, but because what I hadn't done. I didn't understand the community. The last name didn't matter because they're a matriarchal tribe, and everybody that I interviewed and worked with were Young Bears. And over the weekend, the Young Bears had 3 seats of the 7 seats on the tribal council. Over the weekend, the Old Bears and the Pashtuniquas, who each had 2 of the seats on the tribal council, formed a coalition, fired everybody, including the executive director of the tribe, everybody that I had connection with, and I went to persona non grata overnight. Again, no fault of my own in that I thought I was doing the due diligence, but it was a landmine. And as much as I learned from Bellevue, I want to say I learned more from working with Meskwakis, because I learned that I have to be over the top diligent in how I go about doing this. So, quiz time, and I'm not going to give you the answers. These I'll actually pass on to Chad, and you can answer them on your own time. Which of the following best describes centrality? Is it membership in more than one subgroup? Is it the number of links connecting 2 members, or the number of linkages relative to the members? And guess what? The answers are earlier in the presentation, so you can kind of go back and cheat. That's kind of the point. Number 2, the extent to which subgroups are connected is best described as frequency, connectedness, formalization, or standardization. Number 3, true or false? Structural properties describe the way members fit together to form social networks. Seems simple enough. Number 4, what is defined as a bounded set of connected social units? Is it a node? Is it a link? Or is it a social network? And finally, true or false? The rural community typology is defined by loose, independent social networks. Okay, so go back. You can review the presentation, get answers to the quiz, and send your responses to Chad. He's going to post the quiz online, and so you'll be able to actually answer them. So I have. Thanks, Chad. Chad says I'll post a quiz. Questions? I'm happy to take questions.
Brent, what do you think about using social, like Facebook, LinkedIn, or stuff like that for the social network analysis?
I think it has its place, particularly if you're talking about economic development within a given locale. So as you think about economic development, for instance, in Mississippi, having the LinkedIn in particular as a source of connectedness, assessing a network within Mississippi amongst the economic development community provides a pretty good idea of who's connected with whom. There's been a lot of research on social networks and Facebook, LinkedIn, what have you. There's a ton of research actually that's out there. But what it doesn't give you is it doesn't give you the strength of those ties per se. I mean, you can assess who is friends with whom, but it doesn't give you sort of the reputational power, number one. Number two, it doesn't help you assess whether they have received what is defined as the perception, if they've received reciprocal assistance, or what is termed as valuable assistance. So you can kind of catch a glimpse of the totality of the network, but you really can't assess the strength or the density of it. So it serves its purpose, but it's limited in scope. Charles says, how do you know when you have a valid input from the sources? Whew. I thought I had valid input from the Meskwakis. I really did. Ended up stepping on a landmine. That's why it's important for you to do your due diligence. Assess it from multiple levels. That's why I do key informant surveys. That's why I do social reconnaissance. I'll look at newspapers, the last 3 years of opinion, op-eds, letters to the editor. I'll look at minutes from city council notes, or if I'm in the Chamber of Commerce, I'll look at some of the projects that they engaged in. From an economic development perspective, I do focus groups, and you don't have to call it a focus group. You can say, I'd like to bring together a group of diverse individuals to provide me input as to how we can do our jobs better and how we can really move forward the community. And informally, and I probably wouldn't do this if I were an economic developer, I would not formally say I will only work with government, business, and civic organizations, or I'll only work with you if all three are in the room. You can set that up because at the end of the day, as an economic developer, you know who you're getting paid by. And so you have to respect that, number one, and pay attention to that, number two, so that you continue to get paid by them. It does take a lot of sweat. It's very deliberate. Like I said earlier, you can't do this. This is not a laissez-faire. This is not a something that just happens by chance. But if you really want to be successful, you better understand who's connected with whom, where the reputational power is, where the resources are, and what that network looks like. From an economic development standpoint, understanding social networks, I would probably say that's in the top 3 things that you need to do, particularly as you move into an area, because it's going to impact the viability of everything you do from there on out.
Okay, well, thank you, Brent. It's been an hour. Appreciate that. Now, I'll shoot you a copy of this recording you can take a look at.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And give me 10 minutes, and I'll send you the quiz.
Again, appreciate you doing this, and
You bet.
let me know when you come on down to Mississippi again.
I will. We'll be down there this summer. Zach is going to be down. He's going to be moving back